This is Sister Juana Johnson. This is my oral presentation on the synopsis of our papers for the Luke Acts course. First, I would like to say that the writing of the two papers was both stimulating and informative, though the approaches to the analysis were very different. Rezaguet used narrative criticism as a methodology of analyzing the text. That is, he sees in this literary analysis things that are found in regular literature, such as character, rhetoric, style, syntax, etc., which I found an interesting way to look at Bible narratives. While Bill's primary focus was the use of the Old Testament in the New Testament, in which he concludes, after reviewing the much debated topic, that New Testament writers were aware of the context of Old Testament passages and thus used them with their original contextual meaning in mind. Both approaches were challenging but presented the scriptures in a new light. Although time will not permit me to share all, I will share a few excerpts from the many discoveries made in the analysis of the two passages of scripture in Luke and Acts. The narrative pericope that I used for the Rezaguet paper was from Luke chapter 8, verses 40 through 56. It contains two stories of Jesus' miraculous intervention into the lives of ordinary people. This passage, like many other biblical narratives, is ripe with literary characteristics found in literature. The story about Jairus and his daughter frames the narrative about the woman with the issue of blood. Howard claims that the fact that these two scenarios make up a sandwich construction is, quote, noteworthy, but is widely considered secondary, end quote. Marshall notes that in tradition, only isolated stories were handed down, and postulates that the insertion of one narrative within the other is seen as, quote, motivated by the desire to fill in time between the original request to Jesus from Jairus for help for his sick daughter and the arrival of the news that the girl had died, end quote. No doubt, the insertion of the woman's story into the story of Jairus' daughter creates suspense. But Bomford claims it's actually much more than that, in that, quote, the double story can be read as a piece of calculated rhetoric exhibiting the union of opposites and symmetric logic, end quote. Green calls this a technique of intercalation and adds that, quote, the interruption of the one story of healing by the other heightens the drama of the first, end quote. The healing of the woman with the flow of blood found in the midst of the account of Jairus and his daughter shifts the characters as well as the scenes. The unknown woman becomes a main character on a public street, while Jairus' character is set aside momentarily and is later picked up in the private setting of his home. Bomford notes also several symmetries and opposites that occur in the two stories, which I found interesting and had not noticed. First, the man has a name, Jairus, while the woman is unknown. Jairus is a leader of a synagogue, while the woman, who is ceremonially unclean, is unable to go into the synagogue. Jairus approaches Jesus openly, while the woman sneaks up behind him. Jairus speaks to Jesus, while the woman says nothing. Jairus asks Jesus to lay hands on his daughter, whereas the woman touches Jesus, or is him. The girl is 12 years old. The woman has suffered 12 years. So in the first, the public request for healing is done privately, whereas in the second, the private action taken by the woman is answered publicly by Jesus. Additionally, there are two paradoxes in this narrative that interest me. The first is the seemingly absurd question Jesus asks, "Who touched me?" when, as Peter and those with him indicated, the crowd thronged and pressed him in verse 45. This was incredulous to Peter, an obvious moronic statement, since many were pressing into Jesus and the crowd was great. But Peter missed the point. This was for Jesus, who, being God, well knew who had touched him, a teaching moment for all. The second paradox involved the second story and the second scene. Jesus and Jairus had received the news that Jairus' daughter had died during the delay to come to their house. But Jesus continued on anyway after encouraging Jairus to have faith in verse 50. When he arrived, the people were weeping and mourning for her. But Jesus insisted the girl was not dead, but only asleep. The response of the crowd was to ridicule him because they knew she was dead. Verses 52 and 53. Both of these paradoxes reveal characteristics of Jesus and introduce conflict into the plot. These two stories beg us to ask ourselves, how often do we think we know more than Jesus, as the crowd did at Jairus' house? When was the last time we broke all the rules just to touch him? And how have the events of our lives increased our faith? The reality clarified by this narrative bring to light that he alone is the giver of life and salvation, emphasizing that nothing is a true barrier to Jesus, not death, nor time, nor low socioeconomic status. He truly came to bring salvation to the lost, regardless of who they are or are not. This passage of scripture satisfies most of the components listed by Rezeque that are present in literature. The passage of scripture I have selected for an analysis of the Old Testament use in the New Testament is Acts 3, verses 11 through 26, which is a story in which Peter preaches on the power of Christ after the healing of a lame man at the temple door. Bill suggests that the first source to turn to is the Nestle Aland Novum Testamentum Greece, which, quote, notates where a quotation or allusion from the Old Testament occurs in the New Testament, end quote. This early step in the process yielded a number of results, and I will share two of them. Beginning with Acts 3, verse 13, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God of our fathers, glorified his servant Jesus, whom you delivered up and denied in the presence of Pilate when he was determined to let him go. The direct reference to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and fathers seems obvious, but comparing the two scriptures side by side raises two questions. Why is father singular, and why does God repeat the God before each name in Exodus 3:6? Well, one view taken from the Zondervan's NIV Bible Commentary Old Testament is, quote, the collective singular father had a special point, and that it was through the one man of promise that the many were to receive the blessing of God. Thus God assured Moses that the God of his father had not forsaken his repeated word of promise or his people. Keener suggests this was a familiar Jewish expression derived from the biblical revelation to Moses and would have been one of the most, quote, familiar titles of God in early Judaism, end quote. While Berlin and Brettler note this phrase later became the way that God is addressed in the Amidah prayer, and the repetition of God before each patriarch means that, like the patriarchs, quote, each person should believe in God on the basis of personal investigation, not merely tradition, end quote. The second passage I would like to share is from verse 22 and 23, which is a direct quote from Deuteronomy 18:15 and 19. The Lord thy God will raise up for thee from among thy brethren a prophet like me, to him you shall hearken, and whosoever will not hearken to what that prophet shall speak in my name, I will execute vengeance on him. There's much scholarly debate regarding the meaning of the prophet like Moses, or rather, who is this prophet? The commentators of the Jewish Study Bible concur that other sources, such as Samaritan documents and Dead Sea Scrolls, also applied this text to a future prophet like Moses, but Jewish tradition applies this to the many prophets of old selected by God to be his voice. This, in fact, according to the Jewish commentators of the Tanakh, quote, assures the continuity of prophecy by the divine election, although they note that a much later Jewish reinterpretation was accepted by the Christian church as a promise of a single messianic prophet at the end of time. Keener says Peter is clearly presenting Jesus, quote, not only as the Messiah, but also as the prophet like Moses, who was not only a prophet, but a divinely appointed leader of the nation, from Deuteronomy 33:5. In Deuteronomy, we find the promise of a prophet from among the people and a warning against those who will not listen to him. Keener further observes Peter's use of every soul being cut off, and in the New King James it says every soul being utterly destroyed, clearly, quote, echoes a familiar phrase from the Pentateuch, mostly representing any deliberate rebellion against the Lord, thus the allusion being language of just punishment for such acts, end quote. These allusions, of which there are many in this passage, meet the criteria of availability. Luke would have had access to the Holy Scripture. Recurrence, Luke further emphasizes his Old Testament words later in Acts 7. Historical plausibility, it is plausible that Luke masterfully and intentionally uses allusions in his writings, and satisfaction. The use of the Old Testament allusions definitely had an impact and gave a rhetorical punch to the hearers. Peter makes it clear through the use of the Old Testament passage that the children of Israel were expected to obey the prophets who spoke the word of the Lord. It is a composite passage that has a powerful effect on the hearers. After Peter announces that Jesus is that prophet which God has spoken by the mouth of all his holy prophets since the world began in verse 21, and then continues in verse 24, yes, all the prophets from Samuel and those who follow, he has made his point. Peter lets the crowd know Jesus has been foretold, he has come, you killed him, but that same God raised him up, and now you are to obey him. In fact, Peter declares to them, your continued blessing and remaining in God's declaration of all the families of the earth shall be blessed lies in you repenting and converting. There are other quotes and allusions in this passage, but time will not permit me to share. Thus, on to my concluding reflections. This writer concedes that as Rezeguet purports, quote, narrative criticism breathes new life into familiar passages of Scripture, end quote. Taking a closer look at the nuances of the Lucan text revealed much more detail and relevance in the contrasts and commonalities of the two stories that had previously been quickly read over, the significance of which had been missed altogether. It showed much more about the character, heart, and mission of Jesus, and how every move and speech is calculated by Luke to build upon what we already know about the Lord, thereby increasing our faith in him. Luke has taken his time in telling these stories in such a way as to invoke a whole new glimpse of who Jesus is, and as such to cause us to embrace our own need to have direct face-to-face contact with him. The use of the Old Testament in the New Testament is not only a powerful method of getting one's point across, it clearly shows that the plan of God from the beginning is continuing. The prophecies foretold have been fulfilled in Jesus Christ of Nazareth. Its use appeals to the knowledge of who the Jews were as God's chosen people, while at the same time ushering in the new covenant under the resurrected Christ, who is head of the church. Covenant with God was a familiar concept to the Jewish people, and now the door is open for them to embrace the new covenant, which was foretold by the prophets of old. For the Gentiles, it emphasizes the continuance of the marvelous story of God's plan of salvation for all, and provides a point for them to become a part of the story. Peter's speech is short but powerful, and in a few verses he adequately lays out the continuum of God's promise to bless Israel and all the nations of the earth. And now, that was my formal reflections. These are my non-academic informal conclusions. It was good stuff in both of those books. I learned a lot. I saw the scriptures unfold in an altogether different manner. I will never read scripture the same again, and I have a new appreciation for Luke and his work. This is my bibliography. I hope you can read it because it's kind of small. And this is the end. Thank you very much.